with David praying for protection and talking about his trust in God. So here in Psalm 7, it says, "The Lord implored to defend the psalmist against the wicked." It says, "O Lord my God, in thee I have taken refuge. Save me from all who pursue me and deliver me, lest he tear my soul like a lion, dragging me away while there is none to deliver. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is injustice in my hands, if I have rewarded evil to my friend, or have plundered him who without cause was my adversary, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it, and let him trample my life down to the ground and lay my glory in the dust. Arise, O Lord, in thine anger, lift up thyself against the rage of my adversaries, and arouse thyself for me. Thou hast appointed judgment. And let the assembly of the peoples encompass thee, and over them return thou on high. The Lord judges the peoples. Vindicate me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and my integrity that is in me. O let the evil of the wicked come to an end, but establish the righteous. For the righteous God tries the hearts and minds. My shield is with God, who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge, and a God who has indignation every day. If a man does not repent, he will sharpen his sword. He has bent his bow and made it ready. He has also prepared for himself deadly weapons. He makes his arrows fiery shafts. Behold, he travails with wickedness, and he conceives mischief and brings forth falsehood. He has dug a pit and hollowed it out, and has fallen into the hole which he made. His mischief will return upon his own head, and his violence will descend upon his own pate. I will give thanks to the Lord according to his righteousness, and will sing praise to the name of the Lord Most High. All right, so like I said, just David talking about kind of you get what you, in the end, we get what we sow, right? We reap what we sow, and asking God for help and protection in his life. So, all right. So we'll turn back to Revelation now. Last week we started in on that study. And of course, when I say we're starting in on Revelation, you might think that means that we should probably be reading from Revelation, but we're not doing that yet. We had some discussion about just some things, why is it important to study Revelation? What does it tell us? We talked about some things that are important to realize, that about how there's some difficulties in interpreting it, and things that we need to know about Old Testament and apocalyptic speech. And we had toward the end of last week, we had just finished reading Matthew 24, and we were getting into talking about what Jesus was saying here when the disciples came to ask him some questions. And there in 24, let me read just a couple of verses to remind us of where we were at. It says in verse 1 and 2, "And Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down.' And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately." Now, if we go to a different, we won't read this, but in Mark, we find out which disciples that was, and it was basically Jesus' inner circle. Peter, James, and John, I think. Andrew might have been in there, I forget exactly, but that inner circle came and talked to him about when are these things going to be. And it says, "And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered to them and said, and so from there, he goes on to talk about a lot of things, which we read all that last week, so we're not going to read it again. What I thought we would do this week is pick up and read the corresponding account of this in Luke, which we'll see is different in some ways, but has many similarities. And then I want to go back and talk about since we'll have that fresh in our mind, and then also what we talked about in Matthew, we'll kind of go through and discuss these passages. Well, and it's three passages. It's Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. So those are the corresponding accounts of this event where the disciples talked to him about the destruction of Jerusalem. We talked about that, and then this other question that they ask about the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. All right, so if one of you could read, and I guess it's probably DP's turn since Dave read it all last week, Luke, we're going to do Luke 21, and we're going to start Luke 21. Am I right on that? I feel like I'm wrong on that. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Luke 21, 5 through 36.
And while some were talking about the temple, that it was there adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, "As for these things which you are looking for, the days will come which there will be not one left stone upon another, which will be torn down." They questioned him, saying, "Teacher, where therefore will these things happen, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And he said, See to it that you are not misled, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he said to them, continue to say them, blah, blah, blah. I could read today. Then he continued by saying to them, nations will rise against the kingdom, and a kingdom against kingdoms, and there will be great earthquakes, in various places plagues, famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all these things, they will lay their hands upon you and persecute you, delivering you to the synagogue and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead an opportunity for your testimony, so make up your minds and do not prepare beforehand to defend yourselves. For I will give you utterance and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be betrayed even by your parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all of them because of my name. Yet not a hair in your head will be perished, but your endurance will gain your lives. But when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies and recognize their desolation is near, and those who are in Judah will flee the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city because of these days of vengeance, so that all things will be written be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land, and the wrath of this people. Then by the fall of the edge of the sword, and will be led captive by all nations in Jerusalem, will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles, and until the times are futile. Then there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on earth's dismay among the nations, in perplexity, at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming to the world. For powers of... There we go. The heavens will be shaken, and they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift your hands, because your redemption is drawing near. And then he told them a parable. Behold the fig tree and the trees. As soon as they put forth leaves, and you will see it, and you know for yourselves that summer is now near. But also when you see these things happen, recognize the kingdom of God is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on guard, so that your hearts will not be weighed down with this pain and drunkenness of the worries of life, and the day will not come to you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon you who dwell on the face of the earth. But keep on alert at all times, praying that you have strength to escape all these things that are about to take place, and stand forth before the Son of Man.
All right, thanks, DP. Okay, so we're just those of you who were here, or if you weren't here, just remember we read Matthew 24 last week, which was Matthew's account, and in that, like I said, the question that was asked was slightly different. And when I say slightly different, I don't mean like one of the accounts is different from the other, and like one's mischaracterizing what was asked. One gives a little bit more information. Matthew gives that they asked about the destruction of Jerusalem, when were these things going to happen? And then they asked, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Here in Luke, it just says, and while they were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said. So that doesn't really even talk there until you get to 7. It says, and they questioned him, teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So really there's just one question mentioned in Luke, right? When are these things going to be, and when will they take place? I mean, that's two questions, but one around one area, whereas in Matthew it's talking about two different events, right? They say, well, when will these things take place, and then what will be the sign of your return in the end of the age? Now then, if you remember, we talked last week, the big question here, first off, is what are the disciples actually asking? What's the question? And the first answer, one of the answers is clearly what Jesus had just said about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and all those things. The second question, though, is a little bit more ambiguous as far as not in what they're asking. They ask what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. But what were they thinking when they asked that is my question. What were they trying to get from Jesus? And we talked a little bit about that last week. Elton?
I was just thinking about this, with them talking about the temple and everything. They were brought up in a time where they were worshiping the old law. Mm-hmm. And so that had to be a very big impact on their lives.
Well, which is what we were talking about. Yeah, that's where the apocalyptic language comes into play here, because this was a world-changing event. Whenever Jerusalem was destroyed, that was a big event. In fact, most of the prophecies that have this apocalyptic language in them, back in Daniel and in those places, are referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what they're talking about. It's the big event. And why is it such a big event? Because well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We're going to get to that, but because that is when the Jewish nation ceased to exist. And now then, I know that there's an Israel today, and I know that there's people who think that Israel had to be reestablished and all that sort of stuff. But as far as God was concerned, Israel ceased to exist, and who became his people? Christians, right? It was at that point that Christianity, now then, you might ask, well, what about in between? Well, yeah, there was kind of a crossover period there, right? And that's what we see in the epistles, like in Paul. What's the big problem? Well, they're still trying to follow us Jewish customs while trying to become Christians, and so there was a crossover period here where they kind of coexisted. But when Jerusalem was destroyed, that was it. And we'll see that a little bit more as we go through this. But what were the disciples asking? Well, they were. Did they think Jesus was going to establish a physical kingdom? Was it?
I think that was their thought.
Remember, we have questions all the way up through. They still didn't understand. That's pointed out. They still didn't understand that he was going to die, go back to heaven, and that it was a spiritual kingdom that was being established. They didn't understand that all the way through. So this is what Charles and I were talking about last week at the end. Is it possible that they had a moment of enlightenment and were actually saying, well, so when are you going to come back at the end of time? I don't think so. And that was what Charles was saying. It doesn't seem to fit what they're asking. They're actually asking, okay, so when's Jerusalem going to be destroyed? And when are you going to come and be the Messiah that we're expecting that's going to take over and eliminate this Roman occupation? So you got to keep that in mind, because that's the question that Jesus is answering, not when are you coming back at the end of time. They didn't think that way. That wasn't even in their minds as far as what they were thinking. However, as I pointed out, Jesus actually does answer that question, and he answers it the way they should have asked it, not the way they did ask it. So he does answer that question, and we see that in Matthew, and we see it in Mark. Now then, the reason I wanted to read Luke is because Luke doesn't bring anything up about that second question. Like, as we read through there, did you see anything about the second coming in Luke? I didn't, but I'll tell you what, it's interesting, and here again I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to go back and ask this question a little bit later, but in my Bible, at verse 25, it has a subheading that says the return of Christ. So, why is that? Because Jesus starts using apocalyptic language there. And he says, and there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars and upon the earth, dismay among the nations. So whoever made the subheadings for the New American Standard version, I don't know if all versions have that or not, but they thought, oh, this is talking about the end of times because of this language. I don't agree with that. And that's the point that I want to make. Like, just because that language starts sounding like end of times language, well, what was that often referring to? the destruction of Jerusalem. So I don't think Jesus is changing what he's saying here at all. So anyway, like I said, I'm answering a couple of my questions that I'm about to ask you guys, but all right, but that's important to realize that what people think is being asked and what people think is being answered can lead to a misinterpretation of what's actually happening. Now then, here's an interesting question. Did these signs that Jesus does talk about here, do they have to happen before his return? Before his second coming? Of course they do, right?
For the prophecy to be fulfilled.
Right. It has to happen before his second coming. But the question is the prophecy meant to be talking about before the destruction of Jerusalem, or is it meant to be talking about directly before he comes back? Because that's what people misunderstand. They think that he's talking about directly before he comes back. These prophecies have already been fulfilled. They were fulfilled when Jerusalem was destroyed. So that's important. Anyway, those are important things to realize as we talk about this. Okay, so we talked about what are the disciples actually asking. And then my next question is going back to Matthew, and I want to read just a couple of verses here in 24 so that you know what I'm asking, since we read that last week. Verse 6, and you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. And then 13 and 14. But the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. Okay, so what end is Jesus referring to in those verses?
End of the age.
End of the age? Certainly is a possibility. What are the options? End of the age would be certainly one.
The end of Jerusalem.
End of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem could be one. End of somebody's life, yes. End of somebody's life could be an end. What else? Is there anything else that it could be? It could be the end of time, right? I mean, like end could refer to the end of time. That's an option. And then end of Israel and the law, yeah. So it could be all those things. Now then, as we talked about, there's one other thing, end of age you mentioned would be the end of the Roman occupation. That's what Charles mentioned last week. In their minds would be when Israel retakes the land and becomes a nation of God's chosen people, and there's no more Roman occupation. That would be the end of the age that they're referring to there. So it could be all those things. Now, based on when Jesus is saying this and how he is saying this, my take on it is actually when you go back to verse 6, that is not the end. That would be the end of Jerusalem, in my opinion. Like you're looking at it, he's talking about there's going to be signs of these wars and earthquakes and all these things, but that is not yet the end of Jerusalem. And when you drop down to 13, he who endures to the end, we'll get this in Revelation a lot as well. But the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. I think what Sue said seems to apply there, right? Individually, right? On our lives could apply there. Now then, here again with this language, you could still be talking about just using that to talk about the end of Jerusalem, and whoever stays firm to the end and listens to what I say here, because you remember, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the history of Jerusalem, what happened? It got surrounded and then destroyed, right? And if they were paying attention, I don't know history says that Christians got out because they knew what was coming because of this prophecy that Jesus had made. So they knew what was coming. But then also going to so I think he's actually, to me, this is talking about two different ends. I think the end of Jerusalem, and then you got the end of somebody's life. If you go to the end of, if you endure to the end. And then in 14 it says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. That one seems to be going back to Jerusalem and the end of the Jewish nation, but which coincide. Those are both together, because it says, because we knew that that was coming, and so that end seems to be applying to that. What is God's chosen nation now? His chosen people, right. Yeah, there is no nationality. It's now Christians. That's God's chosen people. So it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile or what your nationality is. If you're a Christian, you're part of God's chosen people. All right, so a couple other big things here to talk about to get into this apocalyptic language and how it's applied. Verse 15 of Matthew 24, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so that's the big part of the prophecy, right, that we're talking about. So what is the abomination of desolation? And let's go back to Daniel here, Daniel 9, 26 through 27, if one of you guys wants to read that one.
Daniel 9:26. Then after the 62 weeks of the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with the flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings, and on the wing of the abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until the complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on one who makes desolate.
Now, this is where I'm talking about. We're not going to get into all of these little things and talk through everything that's in this prophecy from Daniel. But what's he talking about here? Like, what's the generality of what he's talking about? He's prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem, right? It will come and destroy the city and the sanctuary, and it will end. And its end will come with a flood. Now then, is that a literal flood? No. Here again, it's apocalyptic language. It will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations, and determinations. And then he refers to what Jesus refers to, the abomination of desolation. What is that abomination of desolation? I've heard some different things on it.
Everything will be destroyed?
Yes, it's going to be destroyed. What was the signal to them that this was going to happen? Like, what was that specific signal that Jesus is referring to? Now, then, if we go back to Luke, what does Luke say there? I don't think he uses the terminology abomination of desolation. In verse 20, he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize her desolation is at hand. So, still going back, what's that abomination? Now, I've heard I heard a lesson once, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but we know that Titus surrounded Jerusalem, and that was the signifier that this was going to happen. I also heard somebody say that there was some kind of that he erected some kind of a staff or an idol in a place outside of Jerusalem. I don't remember if that, like, there's historians. I wish one of our historians was here to see what if they know what I'm talking about there. But somebody said that there was like some kind of a staff or something that was erected outside of the city when it was being sieged. That was also that symbol. But whether it was just the armies, if that's what it was talking about, whatever it was, they knew when they saw all this happening, based off of what Jesus had described, that Jerusalem was about to be destroyed, and the Christians got out. And that goes back to a lot of these prophecies that we see that Jesus talks about how horrible it would be to be pregnant at this time. Because what's going to happen? You're going to have to flee. You're going to have to get out, and it could be very difficult for those who are pregnant at that point to get out. So all the prophecies and the language that's used here makes sense with that event. Another question here. In what verse of Matthew 24, we're talking about here, do you think that Jesus actually just starts discussing his second coming? If you guys remember from last week where we were at with that. 14? 14, I would say, still refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, talking about the end to come, then shall come. But with that, Terry, actually, let me say, some scholars think that he goes back and forth. At least in some of the writings that I was seeing, they would say that he goes back and forth. I don't think so. My opinion, as you look through it and you read through it, is that he starts it in verse 36. Because he goes all the way through, and in 32 we see the parable of the fig tree, which talks about when you see these signs, when you see what's happening, you know that it's, when you see a fig tree start to bud, you know that it's close to summer, right? Like, we know the signs, we know what it is. And then he says, even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Now then, that terminology, he is near, that's where people think, oh, the second coming of Jesus. But I think it's still apocalyptic language there, referring to this time is about to happen. And truly I say to you, here's the kicker. In 34 it says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So here again, to me, I don't necessarily think that he's going back and forth, although it could be. The ones who said he's going back and forth say, since the disciples asked, when are these things going to happen? And then what's the sign of your coming and the end of the age? When they say that when he says these things, that it refers to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then when he says that day, he's referring to a second coming. Once again, maybe, but I don't necessarily see that in here. I think that Jesus is actually being pretty succinct in the way he answers it. I think he answers the first question, and even when he starts using some of that language that sounds like end time, he's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, using that apocalyptic language to refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then in verse 36, he starts talking about the end time, what will happen. Like I said last week, some people may have a different take on that, as far as whether he's going back and forth, which way he's talking about it. But the one thing that I think you can see pretty clearly is that, his language is very clear that of that day, referring to a second coming, nobody knows, and there won't be any signs around that time. Like that, he makes that very clear. And how does he make it clear? Well, he says, but of that day and hour no one knows, but not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. And then if you go down further, 42, therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. And then he goes into chapter 25, and all of chapter 25 is talking about how we have to be ready, be watchful, waiting on him to return. So I think all those things, to me, when you look at the context and the way he answers it, I think that we have to realize that. So if you get anything out of it, I think the main thing is to realize that a lot of times when you have this imagery, this apocalyptic speech, it sounds like it's talking about the end of time. But most of the time, that's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's really the point I'm trying to make and see. A couple of other points to make here. I told you about that I look at what Charles Ryrie in his study Bible has to say about some of these passages, and I told you that I usually don't agree with that, what he has to say. He relates anything that discusses the Son of Man to events in the tribulation, which we'll talk a little bit about the tribulation later, but that's to coincide with how they want to interpret Revelation and this passage. I don't think that Son of Man, we'll do a little bit of looking here in just a minute about what Son of Man means and where that comes from. Let's see. Also, in verse 29, as we discussed, we have that apocalyptic language, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and it goes on down, talks about the Son of Man. If this verse was talking about the end of time, the only way that works is if Jesus is going back and forth, answering the questions. But I don't think so, because then when you get to 32, 33, 34, he goes back and says, all of this is going to take place before this generation is dead, before it's gone. Now, one thing that's interesting is some people claim that this generation isn't the way that we use the term generation. We use the term generation to mean people alive right then, right? That somebody that's alive there is going to live until these things take place. However, they say, well, this is actually talking about the Jewish race. No, the Jewish race will not pass away until these things take place. How does that make sense, though? Because there's always going to be people of Jewish ancestry all the way. I mean, I guess they're saying, well, that's to the end of the world. But then why would Jesus say that? Like, how does that make sense in this context? It doesn't, to me it doesn't. Like, why? Okay, so this or is he saying humanity's not going to pass away until my second coming? I don't understand how they would do that. I think it's a bit of a stretch, and I don't think it fits in with the context there. But the reason they do this is to make it fit with their interpretation that it is referring to Jesus' second coming. So if you say, well, this is referring to mankind or the Jewish nation or heritage, then it would make sense. But like I said, we'll talk a little bit more as we get into that. Now, here's another interesting thing as you go through Matthew 25 or 24 that can cause problems. In 36 through 41, which is where I say he starts talking about his second coming, he still says some things that are interesting, like that can cause people to misinterpret or to not know what he's talking about. Like here, let's just read 36 through 41 real quick so we know what I'm saying here. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there shall be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Okay, so here's where it gets a little interesting as far as where you can kind of not see exactly what might be being said there. So I say in 36, he says, but of that day and hour no one knows. So that indicates we're talking about his second coming, answering the question the way that it should have been answered, what they should have been asking. And he says, for as in those days, he uses Noah as an example. They didn't realize that the flood was coming and that they were about to be destroyed. That'll be the way it'll be at the end. Nobody will know that it's about to happen, and that'll cause that problem, but cause a problem for those who aren't prepared. But then it says, then there shall be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken and one will be left. Now then, that's where some things happen with some people interpreting things to happen at the rapture. You've heard, once again, we'll get into that term, those kind of things. What do you think those verses, what is Jesus trying to say with those verses?
The believer and the non-believer, and those are the ones that are going to be around and those that won't.
Yeah, I don't think he's referring to some event that's going to happen that one's going to be taken and one, like he's using this as imagery. While we're talking about imagery, one will be ready and one won't be ready. One will be at that place and one won't be. I think that's where some confusion comes in, because he uses that terminology to refer to being ready for the end. But if you look at it in context of what he's talking about, like I said, if you take that first block, verse 1 through 35, he seems to be talking about an event that's going to happen, and these are the signs that you'll see before that event. And then once you get to 36, and all the way through chapter 25, he's referring to, you don't know this other event. There's not going to be anything that's going to tell you when this other event's going to take place. Elton.
I'm looking at it along the line of it will be either or. You're either going to be ready or not going to be ready.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's the point he's making, right? He's emphasizing that point. You're going to be ready or you're not going to be ready.
That's it.
Yep. That's the way I look at it and think about it. Okay, so and then just to conclude 25, and I didn't get, or chapter 24, I didn't even get into some of the questions I had on Luke, so this is why it takes longer than what I think it's going to go through these things. But in verses 42 through 51, here again, he actually answers the questions the question the disciple should have asked. He emphasizes that no one knows when his second coming will be. You know, how could he say that no one knows if he just provided a whole bunch of signs that we need to be looking for before his second coming? Is he contradicting himself? I don't think so. All those signs refer to something else, and now he's saying, you're not going to know, right? You know, there's not going to be any indication before I come back and make the second coming. And of course, like I said, chapter 25 has 3 parables that continue to emphasize that we need to be ready for his return all the time, because we don't know and we won't know when it's going to happen. So we need to live our lives in a way that we're always prepared for his second coming, that we're always ready for his return. We don't need to be looking for signs. We don't need to be looking for all these things that are going to happen. We need to just be ready. And that's the main point. Like I said, I didn't get through some of the questions that I had on Luke. I don't know if we'll come back and maybe get a couple of those or not, but I think next week we'll get started in on really where, you know, on the introduction to Revelation. Like I said, might follow up with just a couple of final questions on these passages. But my main reason for wanting to go through these before we get into Revelation is just kind of to get used to this kind of language. And like I said, a lot of people link Revelation with these passages in what I think can be a misinterpretation of what Jesus is saying here. So I thought it was important to kind of lay the foundation with that before we get into that. So, all right. Well, thank you all for your attention and comments, and we will be back for worship in about 15 minutes, and then we'll pick up there next week.